Hey, good morning. Welcome once again to our daily reflection with Andy as we continue in our time together in Acts. You see, I'm still here in Hattiesburg with our older adult vacation Bible school at Parkway Heights United Methodist Church. I've had a great time thus far. It's been great to meet some new friends and make some connections. So I really enjoyed it, and looking forward to getting home. I'm always I like going, but I like coming home. So looking forward to being home with family soon. But I'm enjoying technology and the ability to record these videos and these podcasts a little early. So today we're gonna look at a passage that is one that a lot of people have thought about for a long time. Um, and so I want to read it to you, and then we're going to unpack it. We're going to talk about Paul and Barnabas today, and think about all Paul and Barnabas have been through: their friendship, their shared ministry, how Barnabas invested in Paul, how Barnabas was in many ways the reason Paul was Paul because of the life he poured into Barnabas to Paul. So I want to read today and let you see what happens with these two saints today. This is verse 36 of Acts 15. Acts 15, verse 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, "Come, let us return and visit the believers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are doing." Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark, but Paul decided not to take with them the one who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not accompanied them in the work. The disagreement became so sharp they parted company. Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas to set out the believers, commending him to the grace of the Lord. He went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So we see Barnabas and Paul have a disagreement. And the disagreement was so sharp, was so painful that they parted ways. And so let's think about that for a minute. How much Barnabas and Paul have gone through. How much Barnabas and Paul have been through. Think about how Barnabas was the one who vouched for Paul with the apostles when he was not trusted by the apostles yet. Think of their shared ministry, think of their shared works, think of all they had gone through. And now they part ways. And they disagreed sharply. And so what we see here in this disagreement, apparently this disagreement, it centers on Mark. This is Mark, the Saint Mark, Mark of the Gospels. The disagreement centered on Mark, and we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that Paul and Barnabas wanted to go out and do more mission work. And Barnabas wanted to take Mark with them, and Paul didn't. Something happened in Pamphylia. Apparently Mark did something, abandoned them. We don't know what. We know Mark was very young, but something happened in Pamphylia where Paul's like, we can't take him with us. We can't, for whatever reason. Paul didn't trust him. Paul didn't think that he could be faithful in the work they had in front of them. So there you see two competing values. You have Paul, who is so driven by the mission, so driven by the vision, so driven by the call that he had from God, that he was not willing to sacrifice that vision and that mission for anything. He was willing to do whatever he had to do and be faithful, whatever way he had to be faithful to be obedient to the vision and the mission that God had given Paul. Well, then you got Barnabas. Barnabas, who always believed in the underdog. Barnabas, who saw Saul at that point when no one trusted him, and yet he vouched for him. Barnabas, who was a constant encourager throughout the ministry. Barnabas felt called by God to vouch for Mark, to believe in Mark, and to take Mark with them on this mission trip. He believed that God was not done with Mark yet, and he believed in him and wanted him to go. So Paul, who is driven by the mission that God has given to them. You have Barnabas, who's driven by that belief in people and what they can be, driven by the potential he saw in others and the desire to be an encourager to everyone that he came in contact with. Those are your two competing values here. So here's my question. Who's right? Who's right? Who's right and who's wrong? What do you think? Who do you think's right? Who do you think's wrong? Here's what I believe. I believe they both were right. Now, I don't think either Paul or Barnabas were wrong. Paul was driven by the mission. Paul was driven by the mission. He was going to be faithful to that mission no matter what. Barnabas was driven by that relationship. He was going to be faithful to his calling by God no matter what. I believe they both were right. I believe they both had specific callings from God, but now they came to a point where their callings didn't line up perfectly with each other anymore. And so they parted ways. They parted ways. And look what happened after they parted ways. So let's use Barnabas. Barnabas believed in Mark. He poured into Mark. And what happened? Mark became a great leader in the church. And Mark wrote the first gospel. The gospel of Mark was the first recorded gospel. Most scholars think that Mark's gospel was written before Matthew and before Luke's. In fact, if you look in Matthew and Luke, you can see places where Matthew and Luke took almost verbatim things that Mark wrote and used them in their gospel. Mark was the first gospel written, and Mark laid the foundation for the other two synoptic gospels, Matthew and Luke. Because of Mark, we have the gospels. Wow. Wow. We only have Mark because of Barnabas. Because Barnabas believed in him. In the same way, we only have Paul because of Barnabas, because Barnabas believed in him. We only have Mark because of Barnabas. Because of Barnabas, we have the gospels. So obviously, Barnabas chose right, correct? Well, let's look at Paul. What does Paul do? Paul goes forth into eventually cross over into Macedonia, which we're going to see soon, and take the gospel into Europe, into these Gentile lands. Paul pushes further and further and further, and eventually winds up in Rome, preaching in the capital of the Roman Empire. And because of Paul's work and Paul's ministry, the gospel transitions completely and fully from being a subset of Judaism to a Gentile religion, to a religion open to everyone, Catholic in nature, open to all persons who believe. So because of Paul's vision, because of Paul's calling, the gospel goes to we Gentiles. We're Christian because of Paul's ministry and missionary efforts. They both were right. They both had a calling. They both had a calling from God, and they were faithful to that calling, even when it meant parting ways. Just because someone doesn't share your exact calling of ministry or of denominational stuff or of any of these things, it doesn't mean that God is done with either perspective. Paul and Barnabas separated. And because of this separation, all of the church was blessed. All the church was blessed. As hard as it was, as challenging as it was, all the church was blessed because of this. I'm teaching this week at Parkway Heights about denominations and the unity we have, even though we don't always agree. We've got Methodists and Presbyterians and Baptists and Episcopalians and Catholics here. And we disagree on fundamental things, but we agree on Jesus. We agree on Jesus. Just because there are disagreements, big disagreements, not disagreements that you can paper up over. Paul and Barnabas had a fundamental disagreement today over what they were called to do and what was best. And they parted ways because of it. And as hard as it was to believe, God used that. God used that. And there's a hope for me in that, y'all. In the midst of church conflict, in the midst of issues and struggles, there's a hope for me that even though Paul and Barnabas separated, God used it. And God blessed the kingdom of God because of that. So let's Let's never get so caught up in differences that cause divisions to come up sometimes. But let's keep our eyes focused on the main thing, and that's Jesus Christ. And when we do that, when we keep our eyes focused on Jesus, when we keep our eyes focused on what we see here, that we understand that God can use it even when it's hard. Paul and Barnabas parted ways. They went their separate ways, and God used both of them. That's my hope for me, my hope for you, my hope for all of us. That in the same way that God used Paul and Barnabas, even when they had different visions, and the church is blessed for it, God can use each of us today, no matter where we find ourselves. So be faithful. Be faithful to your calling. Understand your calling is not their calling. We all have our calling. Let's all be faithful to our calling, no matter what it is. So, this is a powerful story and a great story that we should always keep in front of us. Thanks for being with us today as we continue in Acts. And I look forward to being with you again tomorrow. Thanks.